Okay, so today we have Dave Johnston again and Bill Gammage. Thank you very much for coming, and we're going to be chatting about the rather controversial question, but a really interesting question, and that is, were First Nation Australian people, were they hunter-gatherers or were they horticulturalists and farmers? And so we'll hand over to Dave to start it off.
All right. Well, I mean, I haven't written
5 minutes, Dave.
I haven't written Bill's wonderful book, The Greatest Estate, or Bill. I haven't read it all, or haven't written it too, nor Pascoe's book. My view is this: seeing country, seeing it in an archaeological sense, and hearing people working with communities around the country in urban and rural settings. So that's the basis of where I'm coming from, and I guess what we have been taught in archaeological textbooks. Without having strict definitions, people knew their country. So it's an adaptation and survival in country, and did it particularly well, and in a lot of areas still particularly do today. It's more than just, we didn't have shops, hardwares, etc. But you needed to survive in your environment. But besides that, you also had cultural obligations to your families, and with your interaction within your environment and family. But you also had a spiritual connection, which through law had cultural obligations with your knowledge, your position in place. So it's not just one block, there's a whole interaction. So to survive, you had to know. So that meant hunter-gathering in that classical sense, knowing your food sources. See, I wouldn't actually put it in those terms. You needed to know your seasons, you needed to know where to get your stone from. You needed to have, if you couldn't have stone to cut down, to make the axes, to cut the trees, you needed to have those social interaction and exchanges with your neighbours. You needed to be able to exchange with your neighbours to get the axes that was being brought in. Exchange being more than just a trade of an object, being the social obligations and the political ramifications of that exchange, whether it's for marriage, whether it's for tying up social and political purposes during war, etc. So it's knowing country. But people certainly, and growing up communities, know their plants, know the types, the seasons, when the fruit or the berries and that are available. But people also, as with hunting, didn't wipe out anything in particular if it was scarce. Certainly I've seen many places people putting back plant tops, nuts, placing. So if you want to call, whatever you want to call that, I would call it ensuring your future, looking after country to ensure that country looks after you. So it's not just the food resources, it's knowing country, being taught it in real life journey. You are part of it and you go back to country again. But there's also a spiritual connection, and those who have gone through law, and I have a hint that you have a place, both in a social aspect and your obligation. You are the keeper of, that dreaming which relates to maybe that species of fish coming through, or kangaroo. So it's more than just a shop shelf. There's a lot more interaction. So, but certainly and over millennium, this is the great thing, surviving over millennium, climate change, sea level rises, so an ongoing knowledge of country and adaptation, and in areas of scarcity, having unique techniques for keeping water, strict ceremony to ensure that you weren't wasting resources, etc. Red ochre compared to the coastal white ochre, different levels of strictness about surviving and laws to ensure that you do. It's not really answering that, but it's another effect that I see. And then the archaeology, we can look at that and interpret, but there's still a lot that is not in the textbooks that we are still finding out, which you learn from people talking, knowing country, because there's some things we still don't see or understand.
Mm. Yeah.
Broad question answer.
Over to you, Bill.
Well, if you're looking for an argument, you're not going to get it from that,
No,
that's for sure. But there is an argument that's blown up, isn't there, because of Bruce Pascoe's use of farming for a lot of what he saw in traditional Aboriginal society. And it is an important question, because I think the divergence between hunter-gathering and farming led to what farmers do. It led, first of all, well, I don't want to waste time on definitions because you can spend all the time in that and get nowhere, but essentially for me, farmers are people who produce staples, grain or meat, either for themselves or for the community or other communities. In other words, it's an intensive concentration on it. And what that does is lead to sedentism, to people staying put because they want to possess and protect and develop their crops or their husbandry. And that stability, that sedentism, allows specialism. And specialism leads to technological development and leads you away from the all-encompassing view that hunter-gatherers have. If I could just spend a bit more time, there's a tremendous chapter by Peter Dwyer in which he looked at 3 types of community in Papua New Guinea Highlands. There was one group that grew crops, were farmers. There's another group that did a bit of farming and a bit of hunter-gathering, and there was another group that was entirely hunter-gathering. And what he found was that in the mental world of those people, the agriculturalists had a boundary at their fence. Inside was civilization, outside was a wild area and sometimes a dangerous area. The people who did both had a bit of both, and the hunter-gatherers, so-called, had no boundaries at all. It was all one. The spirits, the ancestors, came right into the house and right out into the distant future. And that division that farming generated, where you mentally divide the world, leads to the kinds of specialisation, the technological change and the threat to our future that farming now generates.
Can I ask a question, Duncan? Leading then is in the discussions in Australian archaeology as we interpreting the whole debate of, intensification in, say, increases, or, we've had the small tool, interpretation of, areas. Bill, do you see intensification of utilisation of resources at phases later, or is that a term we should use? Are we like use of cycad pounds? We know how there's staple resources, but it's often based on seasonality. Is there? The eel traps in Budge Big. That's really getting out there in terms of one aspect. But
well, intensification as an idea depends a lot on the word increase, doesn't it? People choosing that word. I'm not sure it's the right word.
Okay.
Budge Bim, for example, people took a lot of eels without questions, but not more than they needed. The only time they took more than they needed is when they thought there were too many eels for the environment, and so then they would cull them in effect. So they're not increasing their population or increasing their food supply so they can increase their population. They maintain the controls. So I'm not sure that there's anything in that argument of intensification.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so let me just, you just don't want the archaeologist to speak, do you?
No, I
can see where this is going.
Archaeologist.
Yeah. All right, so from an archaeological perspective, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because these poor students will have to hear me wittering on for ad nauseum about this, but I think that, so you were just alluding, Bill, to the debate between Bruce and some other linguists, archaeologists, anthropologists, but I think it's worth saying very, very clearly that my perspective is that the idea of farming does not work in Australia, and I think a lot of Aboriginal people would agree with that as well.
And we don't need to justify ourselves by fitting into that category.
Yes.
And this is where, and I and others do criticise Bruce Pascoe's, we don't need to be white to be ourselves. We are unique, and we have had amazing innovations,
Yeah.
survival abilities, interactions, which also care for the country in the future as well. And that seems to be, I think, a base argument that we
don't want to go back to that old hierarchy.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, even if you look at it archaeologically, so sure, you've got Cook Swamp and places in New Guinea, which in theory, that was part of Sahel, so that would be part of, I mean, we can have that in the discussion. That's very clearly an agricultural economy that was going on there. And of course you have hunter-gatherer economies going on as well, or whatever we want to call them. But there we see, so there's tailing dam, there's dams for the water, there's channels, there's digging sticks, there's pollen going back, 7,000 years or something, and there's changes, and it's done on an industrial scale.
And the
we
tools
don't get,
as well, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't get any examples that are comparable to that on mainland Australia, however much some people would love to say that. What we have is what you both were saying, which is something far more complex. So we have areas like Budge Bin, where you've got aquaculture happening, but the same communities, we know that for most of the year they weren't using those.
That's right.
They were doing straight, traditionally hunter-gatherer activities for large chunks of the year.
Unlike Cook, where they did stay the whole year.
Yeah. So it wasn't a sedentary community or anything like that.
Yep.
And in my view, far more complex. I mean, this is one of the great innovations.
Well, one of the things when I first heard of, say, Budge Bin, which stands out to it, I said to Damien Bell from the Greenwich Marine, I said, Damien, this has got to be the Chinese coming here. You got weirs, you got pipes, you know.
Yeah.
And I was waiting for a hit from my brother, who's the chair of the Budge Bin. But he said an absolute, because I haven't seen it in comparison. But he said, our landscape, it's a slow-lying basalt plains. There's little soils. You've got limited areas in all these basalt areas. You've got where the rises are, where people were hunting and camping. You've got restrictions to landscape, and so the channels are there, and they've directed them to survive in that area. The other thing was, it was a lot of, wasn't aware of this, was a high density population nearby, and they were not particularly friendly group gatherings at that point, and that was also a point of their huts and them having to defend themselves a bit more with some of the numbers of they talk about having little armories as such as well. It was a particularly different situation there, and they were adapting, within that. So they weren't being on the shores of the lake. There are dams or weirs or something.
I mean, this is the other thing, though, to keep in mind, that all of these features, they date to different periods. So those stone-walled houses or whatever, they're actually only they were dated to the last couple of hundred years.
Okay, because that was where they had an armoury of 800 spear points. So we've got to get that in, that done.
And the other thing that would balance Budge Bin a bit more is, I think that they were also managing the country, the forest and the grassland, in the same way as other people. In other words, they themselves didn't see themselves as simply fishermen or eelmen. They saw themselves as like any other society, using all their country, looking after all their country, and the eels happened to be part of it.
And across the country we have stone tools for grinding, for seeds, throughout time. But they're implements to fit in with that, that's that seasonality. I guess we're talking about seasonality, in your local environmental biosis as such.
And it's regionally different, isn't it? So
absolutely.
You've got those grinding stones in Western Australia. Well, in Northern Territory they go back right to the first footprints, really, don't they? I mean, but in this part of the world, much more, and same with stone axes.
But we, as archaeologists, are now looking at, and so we're assessing from a Western collection, the Western archaeologists, we've got stone kilns coming here, or grinders coming here, they're now going back to 35,000. But when you start looking at it, there's been a lot more here a long time. And those axes at Mudgebibi and that, they weren't just made at 65,000 years. There was grandparents, someone taught that person how to make them. So we're continually discovering. So that's the exciting side of Australian archaeology. But a lot of our people have the answers as well, and in terms of areas of, you know, why they like the fires at this time, that seasonality and the adaptation and knowing your country, the seasons. I had Owen Carriage from the South Coast, elder of the South Coast here before, and he was telling one of my neighbours about hunting, not fishing for abalone, mutton fish, etc. But he knows the seasons when every, to this day at nearly 70. I mean, he grew up there, that's his country, and so, and that therefore you can still have time in those watered areas to have a social life and quite a large ceremonial aspect. One thing I did want to ask, daisy yams always brought up, and this is the one. People were replanting, and I have seen patches in areas. Are they natural patches near those creek flats, or are they? People do replant their heads back.
They certainly did.
Yeah.
There are historical records of Aboriginal people digging across the slope. In other words, those mounds resist water and so on, and people actually replanting tops in them. Yeah, so no doubt about that. And I'd say, therefore, there they were farming, but that doesn't make them farmers because they didn't depend on that.
But also, how long is this going back? Is this at the time of contact, or because archaeologically, I mean, it'd be very hard to demonstrate, to be honest, but do you think that goes back centuries?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Except for, if I'm talking about land management generally, except for the age of big trees and so on, I stick to 1788. I say, look, this is what was going on then. There's still a lot to find out about earlier.
Yeah.
And even that another proof what we've seen today, what's the remnants of knowing country and directing. We have markers in the landscape from shelters, pointers to trees that are actually act as markers as well as other
ring
purposes. And now I'm about to say ring trees. There's a project we're going to do with the elders here, and that's something that we weren't taught in the textbooks. It's coming out, and now we're comparing it. A lot of down here, some down in Western Victoria, they were telling us and knowing what it was, but we're now joining the dots, and it'd be great to have our own interpretation of markers. Some say for burials and other things, and we're about to do a little project next year. But that's flowing, knowing your country, and I'm not saying exactly what that is for, but there are markers. So there's sort of highways of pointers of interaction, whose country it is, and then there's message sticks and various things to allow you to. So, and that can also be for moving towards those sources if you're short or going through for a seasonal gathering of a plenty. Those long moths, bunyip pines, mullet schools.
Do you know about the planting of trees in the forks of bigger trees up around Brewarren and so on?
No, I don't. Tell us.
Yeah, there's a whole string of them,
Oh.
or more than one string, tend to follow watercourses, the edge of the watercourses, but basically different kinds of useful trees, useful from Aboriginal point of view trees, are in the forks of big old trees.
Wow. So when the steamers came through and cut all the old redwood and all that down for their boilers, they took out all the food as well on those banks as well as the old tree.
Yeah.
No, I've not heard of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Maybe we should, because we've obviously gone way over 20 minutes. But
I don't know a lot
it's
of
hard to sort of even stop this discussion, because there's obviously so much to say. And is it worth doing one about, because we're kind of going into a theme of regionalism and nation building and all of this kind of stuff, and trade, and is it worth discussing that, or did we want to do it as a different theme?
We can do anything. I was wondering whether we should get a bit more from Bill. I sort of jumped in a bit too much there, just in his thoughts.
No.
I thought that was great. I thought that was really nice sort of...
Yeah, you keep going.
All right, so
is there
I'm happy to go
anything that you would have added to that, or...
But I do love one last thing. Say for the whales or for the mullet, I love the singing. So it's almost like there's your cattle herding. You're seeing the way there's songs, connections, all that side, but they also sing them into the shallows.
Geez.
So
Where is this? What's
this
this?
is a number of places I've got them taken from.
Eden's an example.
Yeah, Eden, South Australia, up in Nebo. Oh, sorry, not Nebo. The Wirrie out in Mackay. Might be dolphins. The connection. Moreton Bay, utilising. So there's a harnessing, whether it's here or here, and that interconnection and extended work. But you do hear about them. That they're going out in canoes and having the dolphins, having a familiarity, and utilising to harness the mullet schools. So there's a new one. Well, should end in that. Is that we might have done farming, but we were sure into.
I've no idea what that was.
But what I'm saying is, there is those songs about that connection with animals for food.
Yeah,
absolutely. But it also leads to the other possibility. That is, if you think of the totems, people have a responsibility. If let's say you're a dolphin totem, you've got responsibilities to dolphins.
Yeah.
But they have responsibilities to you too. They have to do their part as well. They're expected to do it. That's why you do the ceremonies. And so what you're doing there is illuminating a process that applies not only to dolphins, but to other animals. The classic I know from the historical record is a bloke who's with 4 Aboriginal trackers tracking 5 other Aboriginal men. And in Victoria and on the Glenelg River. And they lose the track. And the lead tracker with the white man talks to a koala that's nearby. And when he's finished talking, he says, I'm completely stupid. Now I know what to do. The koala says, you go this way. And they did that and they found them. In other words, there's this assumption that koalas have jobs to do if they're with that totem, just the same as the dolphins do. And so on.
That's what they were saying. Everyone has a place that connects and puts you in place, and that's a well-being, social emotional well-being. But it's a bigger picture.
And a lovely place to finish, I think. Thanks, guys.
Good.
Is that all right?
That was great.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm a bit